I always like to ask a question when I start a talk, so I'll start with this one. Who's currently using Spring Boot 1.4? Show of hands. Okay, you're in the right place. Who's on 1.5? You're also in the right place. And who's using 2.0? Okay, well, you're also in the right place, but maybe for half of this talk, you might not find it quite as interesting. What we're going to do, what I'm going to do in this demo is I'm going to take a Spring Boot 1.5 application, and I'm going to go through the processes that you need to do to upgrade it to Spring Boot 2. And then I'm also going to take, it's an MVC application, and I'm going to take it a step beyond and convert it to a reactive application. So if you've gone through the pain of upgrading to 2, hopefully there's some stuff that's interesting. But if you've not gone through the effort of converting an app to reactive, then hopefully you'll still find this presentation useful. A few interesting dates. So March the 1st was when Spring Boot 2.0 was released. And in case you've not seen it, we have a blog post. Spring Boot 1.5, actually all the 1x line, is going to be end of life on August the 1st, 2019. So if you've not started to think about upgrading to Spring Boot 2, you really should start to think about it soon. We also, I want to talk a bit about the versioning of Spring. So Spring isn't like strictly semantically versioned. You can kind of consider the version numbers as the amount of pain you're likely to get. So if you imagine like a hospital chart with smiley face and angry face, a point release should be like a smiley face. It should be kind of drop-in replacement, relatively little pain. A minor version, so like a Spring Boot 1.4 to 1.5, you can kind of expect a slight grimace. There will be some pain involved, but hopefully not too much. And a major version might give you some heartburn depending on like how deeply you've integrated with the code. But hopefully, like, you won't find the upgrade between 1.5 and 2.0 too onerous. Like if you think about upgrading software, the amount of effort you need to kind of regularly update is like some effort, and there's some cost involved. If you think about like never upgrading, then it's zero effort, but potentially like a great deal of cost involved. So we really do recommend that you try and keep on the kind of latest supported versions so that you don't hit like an Equifax problem and get exploited and have a very expensive upgrade problem. Right. If there's any questions in this presentation, we've got about 70 minutes, so we've got quite a bit of time, so feel free to interrupt me at any point if something's not clear, or if I'm going too fast or not going fast enough. I like questions, feel free to interrupt. There'll also be a bit of time at the end if you've got kind of more general questions or comments, and I'll be around all week if you need to talk to me as well. So with that, let's get started. So I'm going to go through this code. It's all on GitHub. This is the URL if you need it. So Phillip Webb upgrading to Spring Boot 2. And what I'm going to do is I've got the commits kind of prepared, and I'm going to replay the steps that I had to go through to kind of upgrade this application. So if you want to go back and look at the commits in any more detail later on, you can just go to this repository and look through these commits. Let's have a quick look at the app. So I've tried to pick a kind of simple app, but one that's complicated enough that's going to highlight a few of the rough edges you might encounter when you're upgrading. So the application that I've got is very simple. It's just got 2 endpoints. So I'll show you the app running first. I have a cities endpoint that returns a list of cities that are in the US, and then a city endpoint as well, where you can pick one specific city and kind of see details about it. And that's all there is to the app. If we look through the code, let's start with our dependencies. So you can see this is a Spring Boot 1.5.16 app. So we inherited from the Spring Boot parent POM. We are using the web starter, so we're going to get Tomcat, Spring MVC. We have Actuator on there because I want to show you some of the Actuator changes that we've made. I've got Spring Security, and then I'm using Spring Data MongoDB as the data access layer. And the reason I picked Mongo is because when we talk about converting an app to reactive, you need to make sure that you've got technology stack that is reactive or supports reactive. And Mongo is one of the first ones that provided a reactive driver. And we have Spring Data support for reactive Mongo. There's a few more dependencies. We have embedded Mongo. That's just going to start up the Mongo server, so I don't need to install it. And then a couple of test dependencies as well. Digging through the code. So city application is our kind of main entry point. Straightforward. Can everyone see the code okay? Like bigger, small? Okay. So Spring application, just run. Nothing unusual there. Then we have some data access. So the city type has got just an ID and a name and a country. So that kind of relates back to the JSON that you're seeing here. And then we have a repository, which is able to get the data out of Mongo. Two methods on that. Find all will just give me all of the things that are in Mongo, and find by name, ignoring case, will give me one specific city. So this is the call that's done by the controller when I want one. This is the one that's done when I want all of them. We also have a single MVC controller. So again, straightforward REST controller. I want to return some JSON. And then I have the cities endpoint that you've seen that is just calling the repository that gets injected, streaming the result, and then filtering out only countries that are in the USA. And then a single entry for the city, a single city. So just get me one and return it straight away. And then the last little bit in this project that's slightly unusual, and I've done it deliberately because I wanted to cause myself some pain during the upgrade. So the list of cities that we've got here, these are coming from a YAML file. So if we look at our resources, we have the regular application properties, which is the Spring Boot config, and then we have a YAML file which has got the list of countries that we know about. So this importer here is using the command line runner, which is just something that will get called back when the app starts. And then I'm just saying, drop the old cities, create a new set of collections for them, and then load them in. And if we look at the load method, we have there's two main parts to it. This is taking that YAML file and making it into a Java util properties that you can look at. So this is using a Spring Framework bean to do that. And then this is the interesting bit here. We've got, first of all, we've got this class called cities, which just exists to give us some place to put the data. And then we're using something called the relaxed data binder. So who here uses configuration properties, like in their code? Just show of hands. You probably all do, you just don't know it, but configuration properties is a way that properties get from the application properties or the environment like into objects that you can inject. So under the covers, the way that Spring Boot does that is using this thing called a data binder, and we have a relaxed data binder in Spring Boot 1.5 that tries various combinations of ways of representing the data. So it'll try like all uppercase with underscores, or camel case, or kebab case, and eventually give you back an object with the values bound from the configuration properties. So this is creating that binder and then binding it to that YAML file and giving us that list of cities. And let's just have a quick look at the Actuator endpoints. So if I pick info, I get just the name of the app, which comes from this properties file, so this bit here, and the git information about the last commit. If I look at something like env because I've got basic security has been disabled for the main app, it's only on for actuators. I need to log in, so I can use user and magic, user magic or not. Let's try that again. Maybe I'm spelling it wrong. Yeah, okay. Which gives us the actuator endpoints. So this password here is defined in the properties file. Okay. Any questions on the app as it stands? Great. So in order to upgrade this application, hopefully for most applications it's not going to be too arduous. We just need to change this version number. So that's the first commit that I've got lined up. So I've just upgraded from 1.5 to the latest 2.0x release, which is 2.05. And immediately you can see that we've got a bunch of new dependencies. So if I look at the Maven output, you can see we're on 2.05, and we've got latest versions of Jackson's and stuff. But we've broken our data binder. So this relaxed data binder class that's in boot 1.5 has been a source of some pain. It turns out the relaxed data binder is a little bit too relaxed in things that it tries, and it's kind of quite hard to document and describe what it's going to do. So in boot 2, we've decided to get rid of it. So if you're using boot 2 and you're using configuration properties, there's a brand new API that's being used underneath to bind the application properties to your beans. So if you're not using the binder directly, you probably won't even notice it. But in this case, because we are using it directly, we need to migrate to the new API. Okay, so the new API looks like this. You can already see that the code has got smaller. We don't need that class now, that intermediate class. And I'll show you a little bit about the binder API because I think it's quite powerful and you might want to use it in your own code. So as a constructor, the binder takes one or more of these things called a configuration property source. So if you're familiar with the environment abstraction in Spring, you may have seen property sources. And this is not the same thing as that. This is something that's designed specifically with relaxed binding in mind. So there are certain rules and constraints that this thing enforces. However, there are adapters. So like if I go and create a new binder, I can either, if I have a Spring environment, I can do like binder.get from the environment, and I get all of the environment's property sources like converted. But in this case, what I'm going to do is use this map configuration property source. So this one is just going to take any map. So this is the YAML that's loaded in the same way before, and then convert it to a configuration property source. Then I can use it with the binder. Then the bind method itself, it basically takes the name of something, which has to be formed in a certain way. So with the old version of the binder, you used to be able to use relaxed names kind of all over the place. With the new binder, you basically have to specify the name in the way that we want you to in your code. So in your application properties file, you can still have camel case or snake case or whatever, but in your code, you need to use the canonical form. And that's enforced by this class called the configuration property name. But for convenience, we also let you take a string. So in this case, like the name is cities. And as a target, we take this thing called a bindable. So a bindable is a generic type. So what I actually want here is a bindable of cities. In fact, I want a list of cities. So this is the type that I'm actually trying to get back out of my, of city. This is the type that I'm trying to get back out of my binder. I want a list of cities. And you can see there's like a whole bunch of convenience static methods to help you create those. So I can do like list of, map of, or a single of, depending on what I want. So in this case, like list of city. This has also got like a few extra methods on, so when you're binding from a configuration class, we need to give the annotations through to the binder so that it can do things like coerce dates and what have you, respecting annotations. So there's the with annotations, and there's also with existing value if you've got an existing instance that you're binding to. So that will do the binding. If I put that to a local variable, you'll see the type that it returns. It doesn't actually return the result directly. It works a bit like a Java 8 stream. In that it returned, like the stream returns optional. This returns something called a bind result. So a bind result here has got methods like get it, which will get it or throw an exception if it wasn't bound, and then the usual kind of friendly Lambda stuff like map it to something else, or if it's not there, return something else. So this, I think this API is like a lot cleaner. It's much easier to use. So in our case, now that we sort of broke that code down, you can see it's like create me a binder from the YAML, bind it from cities, give me a list of city objects, and then get that result, which just pops straight back out as a list of city. Okay, so this app has now not got any compile errors. So if it compiles, we can probably ship it. So if I start it up, for those that had sort of a keen eye, you might notice something. The old version did not log the fact that we were using a generated password, whereas the new one does. And if I go over here and refresh like my endpoint, it's now asking me to log in. And if I log in using the old credentials, it's not going to work. So this time I need to log in using this generated password. So if I copy that one, it'll let me log in. It's just gone to the wrong location. Okay. So that's not what we want. That's not what the old application did. The old application had a defined password. And you might be wondering why it's not been picked up with the new version of Spring Boot. So the reason is we've taken the opportunity in 2.0 to rationalize a lot of the property names that we had. So you can imagine as Boot 1 was released and then 1.2, 1.3, etc., we added more and more properties. And at Spring Boot 2, we realized that some of them needed to be reorganized. They needed to be put under different root namespaces. And the two here that we're getting a problem with are highlighted in red because I'm using an IDE that supports Spring Boot. So if you're using STS or if you're using IntelliJ, you'll get some errors in your code and it will tell you what's wrong. So in this case, the security user password property, it's telling me that that's been deprecated and I need to use Spring Security user password instead. So I can just fix that here. But as you can imagine, if you're upgrading a kind of big application, you may want to spend the sort of first bit of your time getting the application running and not worry about migrating all these properties. So in order to help you, we've given an additional tool to you that you can use. So this is the next commit. So there's an extra jar. We don't recommend that you use this in production, but if you're just starting to migrate your app, you can include this thing called the Spring Boot Properties Migrator. And this thing, it has a certain cost to it, but what it does is when it starts up, it looks through your environment and it looks at all the properties that you've defined, and it finds out if they've been deprecated, and if they've been deprecated, it also looks at what the alternative is and automatically translates the old one to the new one. So if I start this app again, and maybe if I just copy that and refresh it, oh, hang on. Okay, now it should let me log in with magic as the password. So it's given me some errors in my log. It's telling me that the particular property is deprecated, it's telling me what the replacement is, and it's replacing it for me. So it gives me an opportunity to kind of get my app running and then take care of this migration. So let's take a chance to have a quick look at another feature of Spring Boot 2. This property source migrator is giving me quite detailed information about where the property was found. So it's telling me that it found this property in class path application properties, which is this file. And furthermore, it tells me that it's on line 4. So I know precisely whereabouts in my file the property is that needs to be renamed. And this support is provided by something called Origin. So in Spring Boot 2, there is an interface called Origin. As the default interface, it's just got a toString method, but there's an implementation called Text Resource Origin, which will let you know for any particular thing that supports an origin, where did it come from? Like which resource was it in and which location? And the location is down to the line and column number. And we've actually written custom properties parsers, and we've plugged into Snake YAML so that every time we parse a file, we keep this information so that we can now tell you like precisely which property came from which part of which file. And we think that's going to be quite useful. All right, let's fix those properties for real now. So I'm going to get rid of the one that's deprecated and gone, and I'm going to replace that one with the new one. And then hopefully that should run again. Let's just check it. Yep, cool. And then let me just check whether I've removed the migrator. No, I'm going to remove the migrator as well. So that's gone. So I said there's a certain cost with that migrator because it has to like check all your properties. So you really don't want to leave it in there longer than you absolutely have to. Yeah, sure. That's a good question. The question was, does it give you anything in the logs that you've got the migrator running? It does if you found something to migrate. I'm not sure that it does if you haven't. That's a good point, yeah. I'm not sure. I'd have to double check. A question? The question was, is there any other migrator other than properties migrator? The answer is no. The properties one will do YAML and properties files, so the name's a bit disingenuous, but it won't do like code migration for you. Okay. So you may have noticed that when I hit that city's URL, I still needed to enter the username and password, which was not what happened with the old application. With the old application, just the Actuator endpoints were secured. And the reason that I have to do this now is that the security in 1.5 was kind of complicated. So we tried to do quite a bit for you. We tried to offer you a sort of mixed security configuration where we would say, we'll secure the actuators for you and you take care of your application security. But it actually turned out to be quite complicated because people would not really understand which bits were being done for them. They wouldn't like the fact that they didn't know the entire security model. So in Spring Boot 2, we've taken the opportunity to really, really simplify the security. So if you're using Boot 2, what you get now is effectively the Spring Security, enable web security annotation. And that's all that Spring Boot does for you. And that's why when we're now hitting that endpoint, we're getting full security because Spring Security is switched on. So what we need to do is we need to reapply our customizations. So what we want is our URLs to be open except the actuator. And to do that, we need to actually write some code. Is everyone familiar with the web security configure adapter that uses Spring Security? So what we want people to do is we want people to be able to write their own security configuration in one place, but we still wanted to give them a quick way to find the paths that they wanted to leave open or secure. So we've provided utility called endpoint request that, and there's also one for static resources that give you path matchers that match common configuration that Spring Boot provides. So this one, what this is saying is, for HTTP security, I want to authorize requests for anything that matches any endpoint, so any actuator endpoint, and I need you to be authenticated. And then for any other request, you can just come in. And then finally, we'll give you a form-based login, and we'll fall back to HTTP basic. So if I run that, again, and just open a new private window, you can see this time it's now like working as it was previously. I'm hitting that endpoint and I'm not getting the same security requirements. So we should probably test that the info endpoint is secure. So let's have a quick look at that. And you can see when I hit the info endpoint that we hit previously, instead of getting any kind of response, I'm getting a 404. So what's happened here? We discovered, like, relatively early in the 1x life cycle that using the root path for actuator endpoints was a little bit problematic. So if you used 1.5, you're probably used to seeing like /m and /info and /health, like straight off your root URL. But what we found was sometimes people wanted those URLs for their own applications. And also, it made upgrading hard, because if we wanted to add new actuator endpoints, you know, people who perhaps had previously had, say, caching as an endpoint might want to upgrade, and we provide a new endpoint, and then suddenly, you know, there's a conflict. So we've decided to move all of the actuator endpoints under a new subpath. So if you hit actuator info, and now it's going to ask me to log in again. I really can't spell magic. Then it's going to give me the, so this is now working. So this is my info endpoint is now under actuator. So what about env? Let's have a look at env. This one's gone. Something else that we discovered is that actuator endpoints are a source of information that you perhaps don't want to expose. And env is a good example of that. It's got every environment variable in your, you know, container or your VM or whatever. And if you accidentally expose that on the internet, we do our best to kind of sanitize passwords. But if you've got a credential that's not in a key that has the word password or key in it, there's a danger that you could accidentally expose it. So we wanted in Boot 2 to make the sensitive endpoints much more opt-in. So in fact, if you go to the actuator endpoint, you'll get a HAL structure that tells you which endpoints you've got enabled. So this is a feature that was in 1.5, but you previously needed an additional library to enable it. In Boot 2, it just works out the box. And you can see we've got health and info and the actuator endpoint itself, but we don't have the env one. Okay, so we need to expose these additional endpoints. And to do that, we have a property. So the commit that I've just applied is adding this property. So what this is saying is we have management endpoints. If you're taking them over the web, then these are how they're exposed. And then we have two properties here, include and exclude. And I can provide like an individual list. So I could say I only want to, you know, include the env endpoint, or I can use asterisk to expose everything. And then I could use exclude to kind of roll it back. So I could say like I want everything except env. So we think these patterns should give you like pretty good control over what you want to actually expose. And let's run that again. So you can see we have like a lot more endpoints exposed, and if I go to env, there's my env endpoint. Any questions on anything so far on that? Yeah, question here.
You had it wildcarded, so if I wanted just a small subset, they're all different names, what would be
So the question was, in this property, I chose star, but what if I just want a small subset? So you just would do the names of the one you want like that. Or if you want to do the other way around, you can do a combination. So I could say, I want everything except env, so with exclude, like that. So those combinations should give you like pretty easy control, like depending on whether you want to opt in or opt out. Any other questions? Yeah. What are the list of these? So the question was, what values can I put in this?
It was endpoints.web. Is there endpoints.web?
Oh, okay. Sorry, my mistake. Question was, you got endpoint.web. What other ones have you got? So the other one is JMX, but by default, JMX gives you everything exposed because we figure that JMX isn't a port that you should be able to get to remotely. But JMX is there as well, so you can do the same kind of fine-grained control on JMX if you want. This JSON that was returned is different. So if you've looked at the old one, if you've got tools that parse the JSON that comes back from the Actuator endpoints, you may need to revisit them because we've changed the structure of quite a lot of them to make sure that they're more extensible and they're kind of better formed to represent the underlying data. So previously in 1.5, we used to sometimes return lists of things. We now always return a map, which we found helps because we can add stuff without breaking you. And you may find that the structure has changed. So like in this one, if I go back over here, let's see, you see I get a list of active profiles and then the sources in the order that they're defined, and each of those has got like a name and then the values that are in them. And you can see we're making use of the origin support here as well, so I can even pick like one value if I want. So let's say I want to look at where does this info app name in my environment, where's that coming from? And I can immediately see that the property is coming from this properties file, this is the value, and then these are the sources that we tried, and this particular source was where it came from, and it's in like line 1, column 15. So if I go back over here, like this matches this, like line 1, column 15, which I think is like really useful because you can like trace back stuff and find out where it's coming from in a running app. Maybe just briefly, while we're on the subject of Actuator endpoints, has anyone written their own Actuator endpoint? One or two, sorry? Okay, so someone's customized health endpoint. Some people write their own endpoints as well. If you've written your own endpoint, you will need to do a little bit more work with the upgrade to 2.0. So we faced this problem with 2.0 in that we wanted to support both servlet and reactive stacks. And that meant we faced a challenge because our old endpoint code was very much based around Spring MVC. So we actually have a new abstraction. You can read about it in the docs, but it basically boils down to using new annotations. So there's an endpoint annotation, and then some operations that happen on it, so you can like read or write to an endpoint. And then this you can think of as like slightly higher than Spring MVC. And what we do is we take code that's annotated with this way, and then expose it through the various technologies by adapting as appropriate. So we can take an endpoint and we can adapt it to JMX or Spring MVC or Spring Web Flux, and we now have full Jersey support as well. So if you're using Jersey, you can use Actuator as a first-class citizen. If I show you maybe the env endpoint as an example, you can see we have like the endpoint, the name of it, some operations that happen, and then there's also these things called extensions. So you can write technology-specific extensions for your endpoints as well. So this is saying, if you're running in a web, then there's some more stuff that I can do. And we have like, extensions for JMX, web, or you can go like deep down into technology-specific ones. So you could write an MVC one if you want, but that obviously won't work with Web Flux. Right, at this point, I think our application is like on a par with what it was when we were at 1.5. I'll pause for a quick questions if there are any.
Not about custom starters. So we have some custom starters, and is there a big change between how we wrote them in 1.5 to 1 to 2?
So the question is, we've written our own starters. Is there a difference between 1.5 and 2.0, and it really depends on the Spring Boot features that you've used. Generally speaking, there wasn't, we have quite a big ecosystem of third-party starters, and most of them have migrated without too much pain. So if you're doing, like, nothing's changed in terms of auto configuration, or the way that the Spring Factories file is read, or the way that their POM files are designed, nothing has changed around that. So if you're doing kind of straight configuration, then it should be fine. If you've got kind of deeper integration like actuator endpoints, or you're doing custom binding or something else, then you may need a bit more effort. Questions here?
We talked about migrators. So we talked about property migrators, which reads from property files and YAML files.
Yes.
What about environment? So we're reading some, let's say in 1.5, you have the same security username and password.
Yes.
From environment.
Right.
Does it work with environment as well?
Yeah, the question was, does the property migrator work with environment variables? I believe it does, but it can't obviously give you a, there's no way to migrate that because it's outside of your app. You'd have to change whatever sets them, if you see what I mean.
What the question was like, right now we didn't change anything in YAML files, right? So it automatically, when you plug in a migrator, it automatically converted to them and used them.
Yes.
Would that feature be available for environment?
Yes, the migration feature would work with environment variables. It would take the old one and map it to the new one. It's just we can't point you at a file and say change that. That's what I meant by the difference. Any question here?
I apologize if we didn't get to it, but I'm undergoing this right now, and the huge thing, we have SHA and MD5 and salts and everything in our application, and the breaking change I think was introduced with going with decrypts.
Right.
You're going to speak on that, but I find myself having to bring back, certain encoders that you guys had in packages, because we can't just switch to it. We needed a roll-off type approach.
Yeah, so the question is, because we've upgraded the Spring Security version, Spring Security have switched to different password encoders by default, I think. Do we offer anything to help with that? I'm afraid not. That's a Spring Security decision that we have to respect. And I think it is, for the benefit of your app, it's the right decision, but we understand there are some pains. I think there's a format you can use. You can put like a squiggly brackets to like say I want to use this encoder, but by default they've switched. Okay, question.
We have a custom property source where we're pulling in the big data, not from property file or YAML file somewhere else. So that scenario, what's the implications of using that already?
Okay, the question is, I've written my own property source, and it would be nice if I could use that origin thing. And you can, maybe the properties loader might be a good example. No, okay, I can't find it at the moment, but yes, you can basically plug in your own thing. So there's origin is one example, but there's a property source origin that will tell you which property source something's from, and you can also write, where is it? I think it's origin provider or origin lookup. So origin lookup is what you can implement, and then that's basically a way of saying, given this key, what's the origin? So you can have a property source that also implements that, and then the origin stuff just comes through. All right, I'm going to carry on, because otherwise we might run out of time. Okay, before I migrate this app to reactive, I want to show you a few things about it when it runs. And to do that, I'm going to debug it. Okay, so I'm going to add a couple of breakpoints to this app. I'm going to pick the city controller. And I'm going to, looks like I've been here before, I'm going to add one on the all method. And then I'm also going to add one on the city domain object on the getter for that. And then I'm going to start this app with my debugger running. And I'm going to hit the cities end. Okay, so what I want to show you here is I want you to pay attention to the number of threads that we've got. So first of all, you can see we've got a fair few. The second thing you'll notice is that they start with HTTP NIO. So these threads were created by Tomcat. So we have 10 threads that are handling all the incoming traffic for our app. This particular thread was paused. So this is number 1. And you can see that the all method is like being handled on number 1. And then if I carry on, you can see the all method again. The get name method is also on number 1. Again, on number 1, again. So what that's showing you is that a request that comes in is handled from start to finish on the same thread. And that's important because as we migrate this app to a reactive one, we'll see the difference. All right, what do we need to do to migrate? I mentioned that I'd picked Mongo as a technology because there was a reactive support for it. And for any starter that has reactive support, we have like a reactive alternative. So previously we had Spring Boot starter data Mongo. The new one that we've got is -reactive. So that is, if I dig into that POM, you can see what it's providing. So we've got Spring Data, we've got the Java driver, we have got the async support, and we've got reactive stream support. So these are the idea here is that we pick the common combinations you want if you are using a reactive style of a particular technology. So that's not caused any compile time problems, but it's not really going to work because it's not reactive yet. We can't return a list in a city from our repository because these are blocking operations. If you imagine what Spring Data needs to do when you call find all, it needs to go off to Mongo, it needs to collect all the results, put them in a list, and then return it to you. We can't do that with reactive types. We need to return something else, something that's immediately coming back to us. And what we need to return is something called a publisher. And in fact, there are a couple of types that we want to use. So let me play the commit. What we need to return is a flux and a mono. So both of these types are from the Reactor project. You're probably familiar with them. You've probably seen talks about them. They're implementations of the Reactive Streams publisher. So Reactive Streams is a specification that allows interoperability between things like the Mongo driver and applications like Spring Web Flux. It's a pretty simple API. It's like I can subscribe to something and then I'll get information about it. So like I will get like, here's the next element, oh no, something's gone wrong, or I finished. So it's pretty simple API. And Reactor is providing convenience classes called Mono and Flux, which are implementations of that. So Mono just means I have 0 or 1, and Flux means I have 0 or many potentially infinite. This change is the only thing I need to do to get Spring Data to work with reactive Mongo. So Spring Data will see these types and implement it using the reactive style rather than the imperative style. So that's almost worked, except it's broken my controller, and I need to fix my controller. So let's do that. And that's a pretty straightforward fix. A few things to point out. The types here can just be returned. So we've not yet adapted this to Spring Web Flux, but Spring MVC does still support reactive types as a return. So I can just return the mono directly here, and Spring MVC will deal with that. And I can return the flux here. And you may notice that the difference between the old version and the new version is I'm not calling the stream method, because the flux provides like a whole bunch of convenient functional style methods that you might want to do, like mapping, flat map, etc. All right, let's try and debug that again. Okay, occasionally my embedded Mongo goes wrong, so just ignore that error and start it again. All right, refresh. Okay, so interesting things here. First of all, we still have all the Tomcat threads. They are, we haven't migrated to anything other than Tomcat. Still, Spring MVC, still a blocking style app. We have extra threads, which I'll come into later. And then what we'll see here is, in this case, the first one is on thread 1, which is handling that first call. And if I carry on, you'll see that actually thread 2 ends up dealing with the get name. So we're using the servlet spec async support to start an async request. So it's actually, the result is handled on a different thread, but we are still blocking and we are still using Tomcat. So carry on with that. Run. You can see we get the result. So we have the same application, and we have something that's partially reactive. We've got the reactive types, but we're still using Spring MVC. Right, let's go and convert it to a full reactive application. So to do that, I have to replace a dependency. So I'm going to take away the Spring Web Starter, and I'm going to replace it with Spring Web Flux. So Spring Web Flux gives you the same annotation programming model, but it doesn't use any blocking calls, and it doesn't use the servlet API. So in fact, if I look at the dependency hierarchy for my POM and I put in like Tomcat, I don't have it. If I put servlet, I don't have it. What I do have is Netty. So by default, if you choose the reactive stack in Spring Boot 2, you get Netty. You don't get any servlet APIs. Now, if you want to, you can still use Tomcat, but it's not working in the same way as the servlet version of Tomcat. Okay, let's see if this runs. No. Okay, we have a stack trace, and the reason that we have a stack trace is because something is referring to a servlet type. And like I said, with Netty and the Web Flux stack, by default, we don't give you those types. And you can't use those types, so something is causing a problem. And that something is our security configuration. So Spring Security, by default, the one that you're used to is probably using Web Security Configurer adapters, and these are tied to the servlet API. So they add filters. The servlet API is hard-baked into that configurer, so we can't use it. We have to convert it to something else. And the something else is something called a security web filter chain. So this is the reactive equivalent that Spring Security provides if you want to do security, but you're not using servlets. And you can see it's pretty similar in terms of the API. Like instead of I think it was authorize request before, we're now authorize exchange. The endpoint request that we've imported is a different one, but it has exactly the same API. So I'm still saying I want any endpoint to be authenticated. I still want the rest to be open. I still want form and basic login. Let's just have a quick look at the starter change as well. So with Spring Security, there isn't any change. I still just use the security starter because the reactive support for security is baked into Spring Security itself. You just have to make sure you pick the right classes. So it's not like we have a reactive starter because security is not something you kind of pick on its own. It's normally like added to some other part of your system. Okay, ignore that. Run again. So application now running without servlets. The city endpoint works. City's endpoint works. Our actuator endpoint. Works as well. So you can see that we completely support both stacks for all of the kind of internal bits that Boot's providing. Okay. Oh, I should show you the debug as well. Let's do that. If we debug into this, you'll see there's less threads. There's 8 by default. I think it's like double the number of cores. And then I've got NIO3 handling the first request, and then the subsequent requests are actually happening on the event loop. So this is why it's important to be like non-blocking all the way through. If I block here, like I'm doing my breakpoint, then the app will break for everyone. Carry on, you get the same result. Okay. Any questions on any of the reactive stuff? I can't really answer any in-depth questions on Reactor, but I'm happy to help with anything basic. Question here?
Is there a reactive repository, or is the repository that you had set up, is that already accepted it should be reactive?
Right, so the question is there a reactive repository? So the repository interface itself hasn't got any methods. So if you use like repository on loan, the methods you define, the fact that I'm returning a flux or a mono is the trigger, I believe. However, there are implementations that you may have used yourself. CRUD repository, like is the classic example if you're using a blocking application, and that has a reactive equivalent. So there's a reactive CRUD repository that returns the mono and flux and what have you. Okay, quick question here.
How do you deal with like NPCs on Threadlocal?
Okay, so the question is, how do you deal with Threadlocal? And the answer is you can't use Threadlocal. Well, you can, but the thread that processes the request won't be the same one. Reactor has, I don't know the correct term for it, but it's effectively a context object. So the way that Spring Security is like passing around who's authenticated is it puts it in a construct that Reactor kind of passes around with each request. So Reactor has kind of first-class support for the equivalent thing that you can use. Okay, I'm going to move on because we're going to run out of time. Oh yeah, quick.
How do you monitor the queue if you have the flux? It's running in the queue, right?
The question is, how do you monitor your queue? It's asynchronous. It just processes it as fast as possible, is my understanding. You need to probably talk to Stefan Maldini about the guts of asynchronous programming, because it's not something that I can speak with any authority on, I'm afraid. So the question is, what if your repository has custom queries? So the annotation that you'd use to define the query still works as long as the types that it returns are reactive types. Okay, I need to move on, otherwise we will run out of time. I want to continue by talking about metrics. So who uses metrics provided by Spring Boot 1.5? A few people. Anyone using Drop Wizard with Spring Boot 1.5? Drop Wizard metrics? Not many, okay. In Boot 1.5, we provided our own kind of rudimentary metric support. At 2.0, we've taken the opportunity to use a project called Micrometer, which is also a Pivotal sponsored project. And the kind of tag for Micrometer is like SLF for J, but for metrics. So it's like a facade that allows you to, it gives you a nice API when you want to put metrics into a system, but it doesn't really care what that system is. It kind of adapts it to whatever you want to put it in. So we've decided to make use of Micrometer within Boot 2. That means if you're using metrics that we provide, like if you're using the stuff that integrates with the web requests and counts like successes and 200s and 404s, that'll work fine. But if you've used our metrics APIs directly yourself to kind of record custom stuff, you'll need to migrate to the equivalent Micrometer ones. The documentation is pretty good for Micrometer, and you also can see the list of the backends that it supports. So it far exceeds what we could do with in Boot 1.5. So for instance, Atlas, Datadog, Prometheus, and there's more of these coming with each release. So in 2.1, it'll get even better. What I want to do is let me show you this application running with the basic metrics. So if I go back to here, if I hit my metrics endpoint now, I just get a list of them. It's not massively helpful. I can pick one particular thing, and you can see kind of metric information. But what we really anticipate is that people will not be scraping the JSON that we provide anymore, but they'll be wanting to integrate with like a proper metrics solution. So what I want to do is take this app and make these metrics and put them into Prometheus, and then show you a dashboard that Prometheus, that Grafana provides on top of Prometheus. So let's do that. Okay, so in order to do Prometheus, I need to add a few things. First thing I need to add is a runtime dependency on the Micrometer Prometheus jar. So all of the support for Micrometer like backends are provided in separate jars. So if you want Atlas, you pick the Atlas jar. If you want Prometheus, you pick the Prometheus jar. If you've used Prometheus before, you'll know that Prometheus like calls your app. It hits a certain URL and expects the app to provide data in a certain format. Now, I don't want to mess around with Prometheus security, so what I'm going to do is just open up a particular endpoint. So Prometheus, if we see that you've got the Prometheus jar, the Micrometer Prometheus jar, we will add a Prometheus endpoint named Prometheus. So I need to update my security configuration to say any endpoint needs to be authenticated, excluding Prometheus. You can, like Prometheus, you can hit that endpoint, that's fine. I just don't want to deal with like setting up mutual security. A few other things that we've changed. In the properties file, I've switched on some extra stuff just to make it more interesting. So I've got SLA and histograms. And then I'm also, so Micrometer, people may ask, like, why did you pick Micrometer over, say, Drop Wizard metrics or something else? Micrometer is a multi-dimension metrics library, which means basically you can put labels on things. So it's easy to say, like, give me all the metrics for HTTP 200 that were in this region. So you can kind of cross-cut and kind of query your metrics in a very powerful way. And in order to kind of let you do your own thing, you can add these things called meter registry customizers. So this is a callback interface. It's going to give you one of these, and you can do what you want with it. So what we're doing is we're saying every time Spring Boot gets a meter registry, as well as the regular config, I want you to add the tag application, and the name of the app is cities. So it's just adding an extra tag to the data. All right. We don't have time. 10 minutes. So if I run this app again, I should be able to now hit an endpoint called Prometheus. So this is Micrometer providing data that Prometheus needs. And if I refresh this, you'll see like values change. And then to make it even more interesting, I can start Prometheus, and I've got some scripts in this repo to help you out if you want to play with this. This will start Prometheus. This one will start Grafana. And hopefully I can hit localhost 3000, admin. And then if you go to the dashboards, you'll see a Spring Boot one that's already set up. Make that a bit smaller. And if I also have a load tester, so it's just a regular Spring app that hits this thing at a certain amount of time. So hopefully, if I go back over here, you should see things like the heap is starting to increase. The amount of uptime is obviously going on, and then hopefully we'll see throughput and latency information start to appear on this graph as well, if we give it a few minutes. Or maybe not. It's gone so well. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you can kind of get throughput information as well. Okay, last thing, very quickly. Let's just stop that. I mentioned at the start that the upgrade pane for 1.5 to 2 is more than a minor release. Just for fun, I tried to upgrade this app to the latest Spring Boot release that's going to come out in a couple of months. So I have upgraded to the latest milestone of 2.1. And just to show you it works, 2.1 M4. So the upgrade for 2.0 to 2.1 should be relatively painless, and hopefully you won't go through so many changes needed in your own code. And I think that's all I have. I've got about 10 minutes, is it, for questions? So if anyone's got any questions, please fire away. Question here? So the question is, we're not using Hibernate 5. Is it worth upgrading to Spring Boot 2? I would say it's worth upgrading to Hibernate 5. The cost of not upgrading I think, is likely to bite you at some point. So the worrying thing about upgrading is if you kind of keep on the treadmill, it's like a little bit of pain regularly. But if you find that, I don't know what the support contract is for Hibernate 4, but if you find that you're using libraries that are out of support and there's a security vulnerability, then you're faced with a very difficult decision. Do you try and patch it yourself? Do you upgrade everything at the last minute? So I really do recommend that you try and keep on the treadmill if you can. Question at the back here?
Yeah, so if you're on a really old version of Spring and it's like maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago,
Yeah.
would you recommend upgrading maybe to 1.5 first as a strategy, or doing like a YOLO upgrade to 2 or 4?
So the question is, I'm on a really old version of Spring, not Spring Boot. Okay, so I'm on a really old version of Spring Boot. I would recommend doing minor upgrades. If it's on like a 1.1, I would go 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, because I don't think they'll cause you a lot of pain. And we have written them. I should show you this migration guide. That's a good point. So on the boot wiki, which I can't spell, boot wiki. Okay, Spring Boot wiki. My Google. This is a different browser than I usually use, so my history is normally like in there. And normally Google knows if I type boot, I don't mean like the clothing, but it's obviously forgotten that. So on the wiki, you're probably familiar with the release notes, which will give you like if I click on 1.5, this will tell you how to upgrade from a minor version, which is normally, like hopefully not too many of those sections you need to follow. If you click on 2.0, you'll see that we don't have that. We have this migration guide. And this is like a dedicated document that will kind of go through the common pain points that you need. So if you are upgrading, you might want to check that out. It's a good way to kind of help you out. Okay, question here maybe? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, I'd like to upgrade Spring Boot, but Spring Boot is managing all my dependencies for me, and it's also bringing like a lot of upgrades that are a bit more painful. I really don't think there's a good solution for it other than sucking it up and upgrading. Like, the alternative is, I mean, we make no guarantees. Like in Boot 1.5, I think we supported Tomcat 6 and upwards and had tests for them. Spring Framework has got very good back compatibility, so you may find that you're able to like use older versions and manually configure them, but at some point I think it's worth upgrading so that you're supported. Okay, question here?
So we are on Spring Boot 1.5, looking for tools soon. Do you have a recommendation in terms of the MVC app? And you cannot have MVC and Reactive in the same service.
Right.
Recommendation in terms of
So the question is, I have a Spring Boot 1.5 app. It's an MVC app. Reactive looks interesting. Is there any recommendation about when or how to migrate or whether to mix them? I honestly think that with Reactive, you should look to see if you have the problems that it's trying to solve, because Reactive doesn't necessarily give you like more performance, especially if you've got an app that's not doing a lot of I/O and you don't maybe have a great number of requests. You may not get the benefit of migrating. Now, if you have a lot of clients that are talking to it and you have a lot of I/O going on behind the scenes, like you have a request coming in and then you're coordinating with a bunch of other stuff, you may really find that it's worth it. But I would really recommend starting small. Like there's a new class in Framework 5 called the Web Client, which is the new REST template. And that's a good way to kind of learn concepts, reactive concepts, because that's like totally non-blocking. And so if you're having to do REST calls yourself, I would recommend starting there and start small, and find out, feel your way around it. I wouldn't recommend throwing everything you've got away and rewriting it reactive, unless you've got a good reason. And both, we've got to be clear that Spring MVC and Spring Web Flux are both supported and will be supported, going forward. So it's not like we're suggesting people move from one to the other. We're supporting both. Last question. So the question is, if I'm upgrading to Spring Cloud, do I need to upgrade to Spring Cloud reactive versions? I know that certain projects are offering reactive support. I think there's a Cloud Gateway project that's completely built using Reactor. It will depend on the particular technology you're using, whether it supports it. So not all of the things that Spring Cloud wraps have got reactive support, so you'd have to look and maybe talk to the Spring Cloud team to find out, for sure. I think I'm probably at time. I'm happy to take any more questions afterwards if anyone wants, but I think for now I should stop. Thank you.